People like you can't sit here. Ah! Ah!
Well, I own this airline.
You don't belong in first class. The words hit like a slap across the face, sharp and sudden, cutting through the hum of the plane, freezing the entire cabin. Silence followed, thick and suffocating. Eyes darted up from magazines, phones and laptops. Some passengers stiffened in their seats, others glanced nervously toward the flight attendants. But all of them felt it. The tension. The moment everyone knew something was wrong. John Carter, seated at 2A, didn't flinch. He didn't blink. His eyes, calm and steady, locked onto the flight attendant standing over him, her posture rigid with authority, her lips curled into a thin, practiced smile that barely masked her disdain. Nicole Harris, 35 years old, looked at him like he was a problem to be solved. The kind of problem that didn't belong in first class, the kind of problem that was out of place, like a stain on a white shirt. She didn't even glance at the boarding pass he handed over, the one that clearly showed his seat assignment. No, she knew better than to check that. She'd made up her mind the moment she saw him. "Sir, I think you're in the wrong cabin," she said flatly, her words a sentence, not a suggestion. She didn't wait for a response, already motioning toward the economy section, as if the whole thing had been a simple misunderstanding. But it wasn't, and John wasn't moving. He sat back in his seat, hands resting on the armrests. His fingers were steady, his breath calm, but his mind was anything but. He knew exactly what was happening here. He'd been through it 100 times before. The questioning, the judgment, the feeling of being dismissed before anyone even bothered to understand. The world wasn't kind to men who looked like him. Not in places like this. But that didn't matter anymore. Not today. "I paid for this seat," he said, his voice low, almost gentle. "And this is my assigned seat." Nicole's smile faltered for a split second, but she quickly recovered, her eyes flicking to the man standing next to her, a younger flight attendant named Brian, who was watching with a smug expression. "Yeah, man. You sure you're in the right place?" Brian chuckled, his voice dripping with condescension. "Looks like economy is more your style." John didn't respond to Brian. He simply handed over his boarding pass again, then his ID, calm but firm. The flicker of recognition in his eyes didn't escape Nicole. She barely glanced at the documents, dismissing them with a wave of her hand. "This has to be fake," she scoffed, her tone dripping with judgment. She tossed the documents aside like they meant nothing. "We've seen this before, just last month in Dallas." The words stung more than they should have. John kept his posture relaxed, but inside, a surge of anger started to rise. He controlled it. It was the one thing he had learned to master. He knew who he was, and he knew that his calm would shatter theirs. But he didn't say that. Not yet. Nicole's voice dropped to a cold, commanding tone. "Sir, if you don't comply, we'll have to remove you. We have VIP guests who need that seat." Behind her, a couple stood. Richard and Laura Bennett. They flashed their platinum medallion cards, their arrogance clear. They stood there, smiling, as if they had been granted some divine right to take what they wanted. Nicole turned back to John, her smile wide but forced. "We're handling it," she said. But they weren't, and he wasn't going anywhere. John didn't speak. He didn't need to. His hands were steady on the armrests, but his mind was sharp, calculating. He watched the Bennetts settle into their seats, exchanging pleasantries, oblivious to the quiet injustice unfolding in front of them. He didn't care about them. Not now. Not anymore. But when Linda Walsh, the security officer, stepped forward, Her hand resting on her belt like she was ready to handle a criminal, he stood up slowly. He looked Linda in the eyes, his jaw tightening just slightly. "I'm not moving," he said, his voice calm but resolute. Linda hesitated, then nodded curtly. "Sir, I'm giving you one warning. Either vacate the seat, or you'll be escorted off." John's breath didn't quicken. His heart didn't race. He simply turned his gaze to the front of the plane, where the captain was now walking down the aisle. This was it. This was the moment. He wasn't going anywhere. And neither was she. Captain Brian Morrison stepped into the first-class cabin, his polished shoes tapping against the aisle. The low hum of the plane seemed to fall silent as the passengers watched him walk toward the confrontation. The tension in the air was thick, almost suffocating. Nicole stood by John's seat, arms crossed, her expression tight. Brian's eyes flicked from Nicole to John, sizing him up in one quick glance, then back to Nicole. "What's going on here?" Brian's voice carried the weight of authority, though it was clear he hadn't yet grasped the full scope of the situation. His gaze settled on John, who was still seated, calm as ever. The picture of unshaken dignity. "This man is refusing to move," Nicole explained, her voice a mix of frustration and superiority. "He's in a seat that's been reassigned." John looked up at Captain Morrison, his expression unwavering. "I have a valid ticket for this seat," he said, his voice measured and quiet, but the words held an undeniable power. "Seat 2A. I paid for it." Morrison's brow furrowed as he looked down at the boarding pass that Nicole handed him. He scanned it quickly, then raised his eyes to meet John's. "This seems to be an order," Morrison said slowly, but his tone was edged with doubt. He glanced back at Nicole and Brian, who stood behind him, waiting for confirmation. Nicole's eyes flashed with irritation. "I've seen this before, Captain. Just last month in Dallas. Another passenger. Another mistake. We don't need to make a scene. We just need him out of this seat." Morrison's eyes flicked back to John. The hesitation was evident in his gaze. He wasn't sure what to make of it. This wasn't the usual situation. He was used to handling disruptions. But this was different. There was something about John's presence, his calm, his composure that unsettled him. "Look, I understand you're in a hurry," Morrison said, trying to smooth things over. "But we need to get this cleared up." "If you'd just move to another seat," John cut him off, his voice firm but controlled. "I'm not moving." Morrison's gaze shifted to the rest of the cabin, where a few passengers were watching the scene unfold, some whispering under their breath, others recording with their phones. A couple of murmurs rippled through the cabin, but no one spoke up. No one stepped in to challenge the authority of the flight crew. John's eyes scanned the room, meeting the gaze of a few of the passengers who were watching, but his focus was on the captain. He knew this moment wasn't just about the seat. It was about something much bigger. He could feel it, the subtle undertone of prejudice, the way Nicole had looked at him as if he didn't belong here, the way she had tried to dismiss him without a second thought. "You don't need to do this," Morrison said, his voice softer now, almost pleading. "This is just a seat, man. We can fix this." "No," John replied simply, his voice cutting through the air like a knife. "It's not just a seat." The words hung in the air, heavy and meaningful. Morrison didn't respond right away, his gaze faltering as he processed what John had just said. The silence stretched for a moment, and then the tension broke with a low chuckle from Brian, who had been standing silently behind Morrison. "Look, if you're going to be difficult about it, we'll have to get security involved," Brian said, his tone dripping with contempt. "You really want to make this harder than it needs to be." John turned his head slightly, his eyes narrowing. "You really don't understand, do you?" he asked, his voice low, almost too calm for the situation. This isn't about a seat. It's about the fact that you don't think I belong here. Nicole rolled her eyes, clearly irritated. You don't belong anywhere. You're just another guy trying to scam his way into a seat he didn't pay for. John didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice. He simply sat there, unmovable, steady as a rock. "Call security," he said quietly, looking at the crew. "It's not going to change anything." Morrison's mouth went dry. He didn't know what to do. The weight of the situation pressed down on him. His eyes flicked to the rest of the passengers, who were now more actively recording, murmuring among themselves. He felt the pressure building, but he didn't know how to resolve it without escalating it further. He glanced at Nicole, then at Brian, but neither of them offered a solution. They had already made up their minds about John. The entire cabin had. The truth was, Morrison knew something was off. He had been around long enough to see the subtle signs of bias, but he couldn't place it. Something about John didn't fit their narrative, and it made him uncomfortable. But it was too late now. The moment had passed. Security was on its way. The security officers arrived at the front of the cabin, their presence sending a ripple of unease through the passengers. The air seemed to grow thicker, the tension palpable. Two officers, tall and imposing, stood in the aisle with their hands hovering near their belts, fingers brushing the edge of their tasers. John could feel their eyes on him, but he didn't flinch. He didn't even move. His gaze remained locked on Captain Morrison, who was now standing slightly apart from the scene, visibly sweating. "Sir, we need you to come with us," one of the officers said, his voice low and professional, though the underlying threat was clear. The other officer remained silent, watching the situation unfold like a predator, waiting for the right moment to strike. John didn't move. His hands remained clasped in his lap, his back straight, his eyes cold and unblinking. "I'm not going anywhere," he said, his voice steady, unshaken. The words hung in the air, echoing in the silence that followed. The officer's jaw tightened, but he didn't push further. Instead, he nodded to his partner, who stepped forward, looming over John, waiting for him to comply. The captain was still watching, unsure whether to step in or stay back. Nicole, standing by the aisle, had her arms crossed, her eyes filled with frustration and a hint of triumph. She believed this was the end of it. She had won. "You've made a mistake," John said, his voice quiet but forceful. "And now you're making it worse." The officer glanced at his partner, who gave a brief nod. "Sir, you are interfering with flight operations. You're delaying the flight. You'll need to move." John met his gaze without flinching. "I'm not moving," he said again, his voice carrying a sense of finality. Behind him, a passenger in 3C whispered to her seatmate, "This is crazy. He's done nothing wrong." Her voice was barely audible, but it didn't go unnoticed. The man in seat 2D shifted uncomfortably, eyes glued to his phone as he pretended not to listen, but clearly couldn't look away. Brian, standing at the back of the aisle, shifted his weight. His patience was wearing thin. "You're just making this difficult," he said, his voice laced with irritation. "We don't have time for this." "I'm not making it difficult," John replied, his eyes never leaving the officer. "You're making it difficult. This is your mess, not mine." The captain looked at Brian, who seemed to be waiting for a signal to escalate things. Morrison, however, took a step forward, his voice strained as he spoke. "I'm asking you to move, sir. We need to resolve this quickly." John's lips curled into a small, knowing smile. "You think moving is going to fix this?" he asked softly, a sense of control radiating from his calm demeanor. "You think this is about a seat?" "It's not. It's about something much bigger." The officers exchanged another glance, unsure of how to handle the situation. They had expected compliance, but John wasn't giving in. The passengers around him were beginning to shift in their seats, some starting to pay more attention to the growing conflict. The quiet murmurs of disapproval from those who were watching started to rise, but none of them dared speak up directly. "We're not going to ask again," one of the officers said, his voice tightening. "This is your final warning." John's gaze didn't waver. "Do what you have to do," he said. The second officer moved to grab John's arm, but as he did, something changed in the atmosphere. A passenger in the back of the cabin stood up, his phone held high. "I'm recording this," the man said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "You can't do this. This is bullshit." John didn't look at him, but the camera was now on him, and he could feel the weight of the eyes in the cabin. The officers paused, their movements suddenly slower, more deliberate. The captain looked helplessly at Nicole and Brian, but no one was making a move. The entire cabin was waiting. John stood up slowly, every movement measured, deliberate. The officers shifted uneasily. "I'm going to give you one last chance," John said, his voice now cold and commanding. "Call your supervisor. Get whoever you need. But you are not moving me." The air seemed to hold its breath. The tension stretched thinner, the weight of the situation shifting from the crew to the passengers. Some were still recording, others were waiting for the inevitable escalation. But John wasn't backing down. The storm was coming, and it was clear to everyone that it wasn't going to end until it had claimed its due. The cabin door opened, and 2 more security officers stepped in, their boots thudding against the floor as they moved down the aisle with purpose. The tension in the air shifted again, thickening, spreading like smoke through a confined room. This was no longer just about a seat. This was about control. The officers' eyes flicked from John to the passengers, each step measured, like they were walking into an unfolding crisis. "Sir, we need you to step into the aisle," one of them said, his voice low and commanding, though there was a slight hesitation in his tone. The officer's hand hovered near his belt, where a taser rested in a holster. The threat was clear, but it was empty. John wasn't moving. He wasn't intimidated. "I'm not moving," John said again, his voice unwavering. His gaze remained fixed on the officers, as if daring them to challenge him. The room seemed to hold its breath. Every eye in the cabin was on him now, some phones raised, recording every second of the confrontation. The officer glanced at his partner, who gave a subtle nod. "Sir, if you don't comply, we will be forced to remove you." There was no attempt to soften the words, no appeal to reason. Just a cold, firm statement of what they believed was their duty. But it was clear to everyone now. They were just puppets in a much bigger game. John didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. His hands were still clasped together in his lap, a steady reminder of the calm authority he held in that moment. "You don't understand," he said, his tone cold, his eyes piercing through them like knives. "This isn't about the seat. It's about you thinking you can control where I sit, who I am, because of how I look, because of what you expect of people like me." The words hung in the air, thick with meaning, sharp with truth. For a moment, the officers hesitated. There was no quick response. The captain, watching from the front of the cabin, shifted uncomfortably, his hands gripping the armrest of the cockpit door. He hadn't anticipated this level of defiance. He hadn't anticipated that his crew would falter. Nicole stepped forward, a smirk playing at the corner of her lips, but her eyes were narrow, her hands trembling just slightly at her sides. "Enough of this. He's clearly disrupting the flight. He's causing a scene. It's time for him to go," she said, trying to assert some kind of control, but her voice faltered under the weight of her own words. The officer nearest to her nodded, stepping closer to John. Sir, we're asking you one last time. Step into the aisle or we'll have to escalate this. John looked up at the officer, his gaze unwavering. You think escalating this will change anything? You think pushing me out of my seat will make you right? Or will it just expose everything you've been too blind to see? The officer's jaw clenched, but he said nothing. The tension in the cabin grew unbearable, the passengers still watching, their silence loud. Some were still filming, some whispering, but no one spoke out. Everyone knew that something was about to give, but no one could predict how. John slowly stood up, his movements deliberate, controlled. The officers didn't move. They didn't try to stop him. He took a slow, purposeful step into the aisle, his eyes still fixed on the security officer closest to him. The weight of his words still hung in the air like a sword. You want to escalate it? John asked, his voice cold, cutting through the silence. Then let's escalate it. Let's see who gets dragged off this plane in the end. The officer took a step back, his hand still hovering near his taser, but something had changed. He wasn't sure anymore. He wasn't sure what would happen next. The room had shifted, the power balance had tipped. The captain, the crew, the officers, they were no longer in control. The passengers, the ones who had quietly watched it all unfold, felt it too. This wasn't just about John. This was about all of them, about standing up, about speaking out, about demanding respect in the face of judgment. And for the first time in this entire ordeal, John smiled, a cold, knowing smile. He wasn't worried. He wasn't intimidated. He was finally playing his hand, and he was going to make sure they all saw exactly who they were dealing with. The captain's voice crackled through the intercom, low and hesitant. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Peterson speaking. Due to an incident in first class, we ask that all passengers remain seated with seatbelts fastened while we address the situation. We appreciate your cooperation. The words echoed in the silence that followed. The tension in the cabin was unbearable, the air thick with uncertainty and anticipation. Everyone knew something big was happening, but no one could quite grasp what it meant yet. John stood in the aisle, unmoving, eyes locked on the officer in front of him. His body was still, but his mind was a whirlwind of calculated thoughts. The security officers were stationed behind him, their presence a heavy weight, but John didn't care. He had already won. He could feel the subtle shift in the room, the power slowly moving from the crew to the passengers. His calm, his refusal to back down, was shaking the foundation of everything they believed they could control. One of the officers, his hand still hovering near his taser, finally spoke. Sir, we're asking you to leave the aircraft now. His words were firm, but there was no conviction in them. He was speaking more out of protocol than belief, unsure whether this was the right path to take. John glanced at him, his gaze unwavering, and then slowly turned to face the rest of the cabin. The passengers, who had been quietly observing, were now fully engaged, their attention fixed on John. Some were recording, their phones held high, capturing the scene as if they were witnesses to something monumental. Others were murmuring to one another, some in disbelief, some in quiet support. A woman in the back of the cabin caught John's eye, her face sympathetic, and she gave him a subtle nod. He returned the gesture with a small, appreciative smile. The tide was turning, and it wasn't just about this flight anymore. It was about something much larger. The security officers moved in slightly, trying to surround him. But John didn't flinch. He stood his ground, towering over them with a calm intensity that made them hesitate. "You're wasting your time," he said softly, his voice cutting through the tension. "I'm not leaving. I'm not going anywhere." His words were simple, but they carried the weight of authority. There was no fear in him, no sign of the pressure he had been under. He was in control now. Captain Peterson appeared at the front of the cabin, his expression grim, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. He walked down the aisle slowly, his shoes clicking against the floor, as if he was trying to buy time, trying to figure out what to do next. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice strained but professional. Nicole stepped forward, her voice shaky. "This passenger is refusing to move from a seat that's been reassigned," she said, her eyes not meeting John's. She had lost her confidence, and it showed. The arrogance that had once been so apparent in her demeanor was now gone. She was just another player in a situation spiraling out of control. Captain Peterson looked at John, then back at Nicole and the officers. He seemed to take a moment to process everything. The cabin, once filled with the low hum of in-flight chatter, was now eerily quiet. All eyes were on him. He could feel the pressure building, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. "I see," he said finally, his tone wavering. "Sir, can we talk about this calmly?" John didn't answer immediately. He just stood there, his gaze steady and unwavering. "We can talk," he said finally, his voice low but firm. "But make no mistake, I'm not leaving this seat. Not for you. Not for anyone." The silence in the cabin was deafening. Captain Peterson stood there for a moment, unsure of how to proceed. The officers behind him shifted uncomfortably, their hands still hovering near their belts, but neither of them made a move to advance. Then, slowly, the captain nodded, a subtle acknowledgement of defeat. The tension in the cabin remained, but it was no longer directed solely at John. It had shifted. The passengers, once passive observers, were now active participants in the unfolding drama. They had seen the truth. They had witnessed the injustice. John took a deep breath, his eyes sweeping over the cabin one last time. He wasn't just standing up for himself anymore. He was standing up for everyone who had ever been underestimated, for everyone who had ever been dismissed because of how they looked or where they came from. This was his moment, and it wasn't going to be taken from him. The door to the cockpit opened, and Captain Peterson stepped inside, his face set in a hard, determined expression. The crew was still watching, unsure of what would happen next. Their eyes shifted from John to the captain, waiting for a decision. Peterson's boots thudded quietly against the floor as he moved down the aisle, his gaze locked onto John, who still stood in the middle of the cabin, unshaken. "Sir," Peterson began, his voice cold but firm, "I understand this situation is frustrating, but we need to resolve this. This is not the time or place for this kind of disruption." John met his gaze, his expression steady. "I'm not causing a disruption. I'm sitting in my seat, in the seat I paid for. The disruption started the moment your crew decided I didn't belong here." His words rang out, clear and controlled, every syllable cutting through the tension like a blade. The captain's face hardened, but there was something else there now, something that wasn't anger. It was doubt. The man in front of him wasn't just any passenger. John wasn't a problem to be solved. He was a force, unyielding and calm, and the captain had begun to realize that this wasn't going to be the easy resolution he had hoped for. "Look, I'm not here to argue with you," Peterson said, trying to regain some semblance of authority. "We need to follow procedure. The passengers are becoming uncomfortable. We have to ensure a smooth operation." John's voice dropped lower, carrying a weight that made Peterson pause. "You're more concerned with a smooth operation than doing what's right. You're more concerned with saving face than doing your job." He took a slow breath, letting his words sink in. "You're not handling this situation. You're just trying to put the blame on me, because I don't fit your image of who should be in first class." There it was. The real issue, laid bare in the open air. The silent prejudice that had been festering under the surface, the assumption that John didn't belong there simply because of his appearance, his background. Peterson could feel it, could see it now. His hand clenched, his mind racing for a way out. But deep down, he knew that escape wasn't possible. "We've done everything we can to resolve this calmly," Peterson said, his voice slipping back into the familiar monotone of authority. "I'm going to have to ask you to deplane." John didn't even blink. His response was simple, but it carried the weight of everything he had endured in that moment. "You can ask all you want, but I'm not leaving." The captain stood there, staring at John as if he were a puzzle he couldn't solve. Behind him, Nicole's eyes flickered nervously. She had been standing by the side, arms crossed, but now she shifted her weight, glancing uneasily at the passengers watching. This wasn't the smooth flight they had all expected, and they could feel the shift, the tide turning in the cabin. The security officers were still behind John, but they didn't move. They were waiting for a signal from their captain. Peterson's gaze wandered to the other passengers. A few were still recording, their phones raised in silent protest. Others, seated around the cabin, had become more engaged, some whispering to each other, others holding their breath, waiting for the next move. John's voice cut through the quiet. "You've already made a mistake. But if you want to keep going, we can. I'm not leaving this seat." Peterson swallowed hard, his voice faltering for just a moment. "This isn't how things are supposed to go," he muttered under his breath, mostly to himself. But his words hung in the air, and he could feel the truth of them gnawing at him. "You're right," John said, his eyes locking onto the captain's. "This isn't how things are supposed to go. But you're still trying to make it happen. You're still trying to force me out, when it's not me who's in the wrong here." Silence followed. The crew didn't know how to react. The passengers didn't know how to react. All they could do was watch. Some began to shift in their seats, unsure of what they were witnessing. But one thing was clear. The power had shifted. John wasn't just fighting for a seat. He was fighting for respect, for fairness. He wasn't backing down, and neither were the passengers who had silently supported him. A long moment passed before Peterson spoke again, his voice cracking under the weight of the decision. "You win," he said quietly, almost to himself. "You can stay. We'll figure this out later." John nodded once, his calm demeanor never breaking. "I'm not here to win. I'm just here to sit in the seat I paid for." As the captain turned away, the cabin exhaled collectively, the silent battle finally coming to a close. But the ripples of what had just happened would last long after the flight landed. The cabin slowly returned to its uneasy calm, but the atmosphere had shifted. John sat back down in his seat, his hands folded on his lap, his gaze moving from one passenger to the next. Some were still recording, their phones held high, while others looked around with uncertainty. A few whispered to each other, but no one spoke directly. The tension, thick and heavy, hung in the air like smoke. Nicole remained standing by the aisle, her arms crossed tightly, her eyes darting nervously from the captain to the security officers. Brian, who had been so eager to escalate the situation, stood in the back of the cabin, his expression unreadable. Captain Peterson, his face pale, moved back toward the cockpit, his steps slow, as if weighed down by the realization that he had just lost control. John glanced over at the flight attendants, his eyes meeting Nicole's for a brief moment. She quickly looked away, her face flushed with embarrassment. He could see the doubt creeping into her posture, the cracks in her authority showing. She had underestimated him, and now she had to live with the consequences. The minutes ticked by, the hum of the plane's engines filling the silence, but the feeling of something being broken, of something irreparable, lingered. John didn't feel victorious. He wasn't here to win. He wasn't here to prove a point. He was here because this was his seat, and he wasn't going to let anyone take it from him. But as the flight continued, he realized something had changed in the cabin. The passengers were no longer just passive observers. Some were beginning to speak out. One by one, people started speaking up, their voices low but filled with resolve. "He's right," a man in seat 3B muttered, loud enough for those nearby to hear. "He paid for that seat. He should be able to sit there." A woman in 2D nodded in agreement. "I don't know what's going on, but this is wrong." A murmur of support spread throughout the cabin like wildfire, and soon it wasn't just the passengers in the first-class cabin who were noticing. The buzz reached the back of the plane. John's heart didn't race. He remained calm, but the weight of what was happening now hit him like a wave. This wasn't just about a seat on a plane anymore. It was about power, about control, and about how quickly things could shift when people decided to stand together. As the flight continued, the tension in the cabin didn't completely dissipate, but it began to change. The subtle whispers of support from passengers became louder. A few passengers stood up, stretching their legs, but now they were looking at the crew, watching every move. The flight attendants, who had once carried the confidence of those in control, now walked the aisle with a strange hesitation, eyes flicking toward John, avoiding his gaze. The captain returned to the cabin, his face still set in a hard line. But now there was something different in his eyes, a flicker of recognition. He glanced briefly at the passengers, who were no longer passive. He met John's gaze, and for the first time in this entire ordeal, there was no condescension in his eyes. There was nothing to say. There was nothing to do. The damage had already been done. John leaned back in his seat, his posture still composed, his mind now far away from the plane. The battle had been won. But the war? That was just beginning. He knew the moment the plane touched down, things would move fast. His team was already working behind the scenes, gathering information, gathering power. His assistant, Rachel, would be ready. The board would be informed. And when the flight landed, when the doors opened, it wouldn't just be the crew that faced consequences. The company would be held accountable. John's phone buzzed in his pocket, but he didn't move to check it. He already knew what it would say. The wheels were already in motion. The rest of the flight was quiet, the passengers now aware of their place in the unfolding story. John knew this wasn't just a fight for himself. This was a fight for every passenger who had been dismissed, for every person who had ever been judged based on how they looked, how they dressed, or where they came from. And he wasn't going to stop until that fight was won. The plane touched down in Los Angeles, the wheels screeching against the runway, but the sound felt distant. John sat still in his seat, his eyes focused on the window, watching as the airport came into view. The rest of the passengers began to stir, gathering their things, but the air in the cabin was heavy, still charged with the energy of what had just happened. As the seatbelt sign dinged off, the flight attendants began to move more quickly, their steps now sharp and deliberate. Nicole passed by John's seat, her eyes avoiding his, her face flushed with humiliation. She had been confident before. She had believed she was in control. Now, it was clear she wasn't. The thought seemed to hang in the air between them as she walked past, but she didn't dare say a word. John gathered his briefcase and stood up slowly, his movements deliberate. He didn't rush, didn't hurry. He had nothing to prove. The officers who had been stationed by the aisle looked at him, their hands still hovering near their belts, but they didn't move to stop him. They had seen the change in the air. They knew who had won. As he stepped into the aisle, He passed by the passengers who had witnessed the scene, their eyes on him, some with sympathy, others with awe. A few nodded at him as he walked past, a silent recognition of what had just transpired. He wasn't just a man on a plane anymore. He was someone who had made them rethink their assumptions. At the gate, 2 members of the ground crew stood waiting, their faces neutral. They weren't sure what to expect, but they knew their orders. John approached them slowly, his steps measured, and the tension in the air grew thicker as they prepared to greet him. One of them, a woman in her 30s, stepped forward with a clipboard. "Mr. Carter, we've arranged for a car to take you to the terminal. The board is expecting you," she said, her voice steady, but not without a hint of nervousness. John nodded once, his gaze sweeping over her face, noting the slight tremor in her hands. She wasn't used to being in this position. She wasn't used to standing in front of someone who wasn't afraid to push back. "I'll take the car," John said quietly, his voice calm, but carrying the weight of everything that had just happened. "But you need to make sure the board is ready. I'm not here to waste time." The woman swallowed, but she nodded. "Of course, Mr. Carter. They've been briefed." John turned and began walking down the jet bridge, his briefcase in hand. The sound of his footsteps echoed in the otherwise silent space. The crew members behind him didn't follow, but they watched him leave, the realization dawning on them that this was only the beginning. As he reached the terminal, John's phone buzzed again. This time he didn't hesitate. He pulled it from his pocket and glanced at the message from Rachel. "Board has been notified. They'll meet you in the conference room. We have the full video." John's lips tightened into a smile. He knew it was only a matter of time before the full weight of what had happened hit the company. He wasn't just a passenger who had been wrongly accused. He was the CEO, and it was his turn to make the calls now. He walked past the security checkpoint, where the officers gave him a quick, respectful nod. They were still watching him, still unsure of the full scope of who he was, but the respect was there. It wasn't just the uniform he wore. It was the calm, the confidence, the way he carried himself. The conference room doors swung open, and John stepped inside. The room was already filled with the company's top executives. They had been waiting for him. But now, as he walked into the room, the atmosphere shifted. They knew who he was, and they knew what had happened. John didn't sit immediately. He stood at the head of the table, looking each of them in the eye. "I trust everyone here understands the gravity of today's situation," he said, his voice low but carrying authority. "I expect full transparency. This is about more than just a flight. This is about who we are as a company." The silence in the room was thick, and no one dared speak yet. The weight of his presence was undeniable. The room remained silent, the tension palpable as John stood before the board. Each executive at the table sat rigid, the weight of the moment pressing down on them. They knew they were facing more than just a confrontation with a passenger. They were facing a reckoning. John's presence alone commanded authority. He was no longer just the CEO. They now understood that he was someone who had been watching, waiting for this moment to expose the cracks in their company. Rachel was the first to break the silence, stepping into the room with a folder in her hand. She approached the table and placed the folder in front of John, her gaze flicking briefly to the executives before meeting his. "We have the full footage," she said quietly. "It's been uploaded to the system. I've already notified the legal team and PR." John nodded, then turned his attention back to the board. "What I saw today," he said slowly, his voice unwavering, "was more than just incompetence. It was a culture of bias, a culture that's been allowed to fester and spread throughout this company for far too long. And it's not just Nicole or Brian or the captain. This goes deeper." He let the words hang in the air, watching as the room shifted uncomfortably. The executives shifted in their seats, their faces betraying the realization that they had underestimated him. They had seen him as a distant figure, a CEO too busy with numbers and deals to care about what went on behind the scenes. But now they understood. He was exactly the kind of person who would care and do something about it. "Do you know how many people are watching this right now?" John continued, his gaze turning cold. "The video of what happened has already gone viral. Social media is already lit up with the hashtag Skyline Shock. There are thousands of people demanding accountability, and it's only going to grow. What you do now will define this company for years to come." A murmur spread across the room, some executives glancing nervously at one another. One of the senior board members, Richard, shifted uncomfortably in his chair and cleared his throat. "John, No!" John interrupted sharply, raising his hand. "I don't want to hear it. This isn't about defending your positions. This is about fixing something that's broken." His voice was like steel. "You all allowed this to happen. You let these attitudes thrive within the culture of this company, and you didn't even notice until it became an issue. This is your fault too. This isn't just about one incident. It's about how we've been running things for years." Rachel stood quietly behind him, arms crossed, watching as the tension in the room escalated. She could feel it too, the way the board members were starting to sweat, starting to realize how deeply they had been complicit. She knew John wouldn't let them off easy. He wasn't like other CEOs who just swept things under the rug and moved on. "I need to know," John continued, his eyes narrowing at each member of the board, "how you plan to address this. What are you going to do to make sure something like this never happens again?" Richard cleared his throat again. "We'll initiate a full internal audit," he said quickly, "and begin implementing diversity and sensitivity training for all staff, including upper management." "That's a start," John replied, his tone like ice. "But that's not enough. I want to see action, not just words. I want to see the entire training program revamped, every single employee, from the ground crew to the flight attendants to the executives, retrained. This needs to be a priority, not just a box to check." The board members exchanged looks, but no one argued. They all knew that John wasn't going to let this go. The damage had been done, and it wasn't going to be easily undone. "And what about Nicole and Brian?" one of the board members asked quietly. "What's going to happen to them?" John's expression hardened. "They've already been dealt with. This is bigger than just them. I'm not here to punish individuals. I'm here to ensure this company moves forward with a new vision. A vision that values every customer, every employee, regardless of who they are or what they look like. If they can't understand that, they don't belong here." He stood up slowly, looking down at the board members, who were all now fully aware of the gravity of the situation. "I expect a full report on my desk tomorrow. Not next week. Tomorrow. And if I don't see the kind of change that's needed, well, I'm prepared to make some more changes myself." As John turned to leave, the room remained silent. The board members didn't dare speak. They knew that this was just the beginning, and in that moment, they understood that the man who had sat in that seat in first class was not just the CEO. They were watching the future of Skyline Airlines being shaped before their eyes. John walked out of the conference room, his footsteps echoing through the empty hallway. His mind was already racing ahead, thinking of the next steps, the next moves he needed to make. The conversation with the board had been intense, but it was only the beginning. He knew that things were about to change at Skyline Airlines, and the ripple effect would be far-reaching. The quiet whispers from the staff, the subtle glances from the passengers, They had all been a part of the machine, a machine that needed to be rebuilt from the inside out. As he stepped onto the tarmac, the cool breeze hit his face, but it wasn't enough to clear the tension still hanging in the air. Rachel was already there, waiting by the car that would take him to the hotel. She looked at him, her expression unreadable, but there was a faint glimmer of satisfaction in her eyes. "The board's on edge," she said, handing him a cup of coffee. "They're going to move fast now. They know the stakes." John took the coffee, his grip steady. "They should," he said, his voice low and controlled. "They've seen what happens when a company like this lets things fester. But this is just the first step. The real work starts now." He could feel it, the shift, the wave of change that had begun with a single moment, a single decision, the way people had rallied around him, the way the passengers had stood up, had spoken out. This wasn't just a fight for a seat on a plane. It was a fight for dignity, for respect. And he was going to win that fight, not just for himself, but for everyone who had been marginalized, overlooked, or silenced. As they drove toward the hotel, John's phone buzzed. He glanced at it briefly, messages flooding in from his team, from the media, from various outlets picking up on the unfolding story. Skyline Airlines was trending, and so was he. The hashtag Skyline Shock had gone viral, with thousands of people voicing their support. But with the support came the backlash, the critics, the defenders of the old ways, the people who still believed that power should stay in the hands of the few, the privileged. He scrolled through some of the messages, his eyes narrowing at the negative comments. But there was something else, something deeper that caught his attention. A message from a former employee of Skyline, someone who had been let go years ago. "I see you're finally bringing change. Keep going, don't let them win." John put the phone down and looked out the window. This wasn't just about the company anymore. It was about the entire industry, about what was right and about what needed to change. He had the chance to make a real difference, to show the world that things didn't have to stay the way they were. That power didn't belong to those who inherited it or were born with it. It belonged to those who earned it, to those who fought for what was right. As he arrived at the hotel, John knew the real battle was just beginning. The fight for respect, for equality, for a future where everyone could sit wherever they damn well pleased, without fear of judgment, was far from over. But he was ready. He had already started the fight. And now there was no turning back. If you believe in change, in fighting for what's right, and in taking a stand for respect, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe, and share your thoughts below. Let's make this movement stronger together. #FightForChange.